The luxury cabin was meant to offer peace and comfort, but for Eleanor Simmons, the moment she stepped onto the flight, it became a stage for something entirely different. The sharp tone of the lead flight attendant, Annette Carter, cut through the hum of boarding passengers like a blade. From the dismissive glances to the clipped commands, it was clear. Eleanor wasn't being treated like everyone else. What should have been a joyous journey to meet her great-grandchildren for the first time quickly turned into a battle of quiet dignity versus blatant hostility. Little did anyone on board know that the elderly woman they underestimated had the power to change not just this flight, but an entire airline forever. Before we dive into this gripping tale of resilience and transformation, comment below where you're watching from today. And if you're ready for an unforgettable story about courage, grace, and the fight for justice, don't forget to subscribe. Eleanor Simmons adjusted her pearl necklace as she stood in line at the bustling airport terminal. The soft morning sunlight filtered through the glass walls, casting a golden glow over the elegant older woman in her late 70s. Dressed in a navy blue dress with a tailored cardigan draped over her shoulders, she exuded an air of quiet dignity that came with a life well lived. This trip marked a milestone, her first flight in years, and her first time on a luxury airline. It wasn't just any journey. Eleanor was flying to meet her great-grandchildren for the first time. Her son, Marcus Simmons, had insisted on booking the ticket, saying, "Mom, you deserve the best." Though initially hesitant, Eleanor accepted the gesture, grateful for the opportunity to travel in comfort. As Eleanor clutched her leather handbag, a treasured gift from her late husband, memories of the past danced through her mind. Flying wasn't something she often did, and her excitement was tempered by a slight nervousness. Around her, passengers in designer clothes and expensive accessories moved with hurried precision. Their occasional glances in her direction were tinged with curiosity, even judgment, but Eleanor had long since learned to ignore such things. The gate attendant called Eleanor's boarding group. She stepped forward with a warm smile and handed over her ticket. The attendant scanned it, hesitating for a split second before forcing a polite grin. "Enjoy your flight, ma'am," she said in a tone that lacked sincerity. Eleanor, unbothered, proceeded down the jet bridge, her heart fluttering with anticipation. As she entered the aircraft, the sleek design and plush interiors immediately caught her eye. Everything about the cabin screamed opulence, from the wide leather seats to the soft ambient lighting. Her assigned seat, 2A, was by the window, a perfect spot for taking in the view during the flight. Eleanor carefully placed her handbag on the floor before reaching for her modest carry-on to stow it in the overhead compartment. Her movements were deliberate, not hurried, as she was mindful of the new environment. "Excuse me, ma'am." The sharp tone made Eleanor pause. She turned to see a tall woman in her late 30s, dressed impeccably in the airline's uniform. The badge on her blazer read Annette Carter, lead attendant. Annette's professional demeanor was undercut by a distant, almost disapproving expression. "Is this your seat?" Annette asked, her tone clipped. "Yes, it is," Eleanor replied, holding up her boarding pass. Annette leaned in, scrutinizing the ticket as though expecting to find an error. After a moment, she straightened and said, "Fine. Please stow your bag quickly so we can keep the boarding process moving." Eleanor nodded politely, her hands trembling slightly, not from age but from the nervous energy of being in unfamiliar surroundings. "Do you need help?" Annette asked, though her words were laced with impatience. Before Eleanor could respond, a kind man seated nearby rose to assist. "Let me help you, ma'am," he said with a warm smile, effortlessly placing the bag in the compartment. "Thank you," Eleanor said, her smile genuine. Annette, however, let out a loud sigh. "Let's not hold up the line," she muttered before stepping back. Settling into her seat, Eleanor tried to focus on the joy awaiting her at her destination, the laughter of her great-grandchildren, their tiny hands reaching out to hug her. But as passengers continued to board, she couldn't help but notice the subtle glances and whispered comments around her. Some were curious, others indifferent, but a few carried a discomfort she had encountered before. Eleanor kept her gaze forward, her hands resting calmly in her lap. She reminded herself of the resilience she had built over the years, a quiet strength that allowed her to endure such moments without letting them define her. Annette, however, seemed determined to make Eleanor feel out of place. As she moved through the aisle, her eyes darted toward Eleanor's seat more than once. Her expression remained professional but lacked warmth, and her presence left tension in the air. Eleanor tried to distract herself by looking out the window, where the early morning sun bathed the tarmac in a soft glow. She took a deep breath, finding comfort in the thought of her family waiting on the other side of this journey. Little did she know, this flight would be anything but ordinary. As passengers settled and the flight crew prepared for takeoff, Eleanor noticed her seatbelt wasn't fastened properly. Wanting to ensure she adhered to the safety rules, she pressed the flight attendant call button. Annette arrived moments later, her heels clicking sharply against the floor. She stopped abruptly in front of Eleanor, arms crossed. "What is it now?" she asked, her tone tinged with irritation. Eleanor maintained her calm demeanor. "My seatbelt seems to be stuck. Could you please help me?" Annette sighed audibly, leaning in to tug at the belt for a moment. "There's nothing wrong with it," she said curtly. "You just need to pull harder." "Thank you, dear," Eleanor replied softly, adjusting the belt herself. Annette walked away, muttering under her breath. "Special requests already. This is going to be a long flight." Eleanor chose not to react, reminding herself of the joy awaiting her at her destination. But a part of her couldn't shake the weight of Annette's dismissive attitude. Unbeknownst to everyone on board, the quiet dignity of this elderly woman would soon set off a chain of events that no one could have anticipated. As the plane filled with passengers, the hum of conversation and the soft rustling of belongings created a lively backdrop. Eleanor Simmons, seated in her windowside spot, tried to lose herself in the excitement of the journey ahead. But the air of discomfort lingered, punctuated by the lead flight attendant, Annette Carter's pointed glances. Eleanor realized she had forgotten to take her medication before boarding. Her health was paramount, so she hesitated for only a moment before pressing the call button again. Annette approached, her expression already betraying a thinly veiled irritation. "Yes, ma'am?" Annette asked, crossing her arms. "I'm sorry to bother you," Eleanor began politely. "I just need a small cup of water to take my medicine." Annette let out a dramatic sigh. "We're not even in the air yet, ma'am. Water service starts after takeoff. You'll have to wait." Eleanor met Annette's gaze steadily, sensing the tension, but unwilling to be discouraged. "It's just for my medicine," she explained gently. "I won't trouble you again." Annette rolled her eyes and turned sharply on her heel, heading to the galley. When she returned, she all but slammed a small plastic cup onto Eleanor's tray table. The abruptness of her actions drew glances from nearby passengers. "Thank you," Eleanor said softly, as composed as ever. Annette didn't respond and marched away. A middle-aged man, seated across the aisle, leaned over. "She didn't have to be so rude," he muttered, his voice low but filled with disapproval. "It's all right," Eleanor replied with a gentle smile, though the encounter had left her unsettled. As the plane prepared for takeoff, the tension surrounding Eleanor seemed to grow. Annette's movements were brisk and sharp, her demeanor toward other passengers starkly different from how she treated Eleanor. The polite smiles and professional tone she reserved for others were replaced by clipped responses and impatient gestures whenever she approached Eleanor's row. Eleanor tried to focus on the positives: the excitement of seeing her great-grandchildren for the first time, the stories she would share, and the love that awaited her. But Annette's dismissive attitude weighed on her more than she cared to admit. Noticing Eleanor's discomfort, a young girl seated a few rows back decided to act. She tugged on her mother's sleeve, holding out a half-full water bottle. "Mommy, can I give this to the nice lady?" Her mother smiled warmly and nodded. The girl approached Eleanor, her small hand outstretched. "Here, you can have my water," she said shyly, her big, innocent eyes meeting Eleanor's. Eleanor's heart swelled at the simple act of kindness. She accepted the bottle with a grateful smile. "Thank you, sweetheart." "That's very kind of you." The passengers around them exchanged approving glances, and a few even murmured their agreement. But Annette, watching from the front of the cabin, seemed visibly annoyed by the display. Her lips pressed into a thin line, and she busied herself with the beverage cart, as though determined to ignore what had just transpired. As the plane climbed into the sky, Annette's frustration grew. She made no effort to hide her annoyance, and her every interaction with Eleanor was marked by a frosty tone. At one point she stopped by Eleanor's row, her arms crossed. "Ma'am," she said loudly, her voice cutting through the cabin noise, "you need to keep your handbag under the seat in front of you at all times." Eleanor, confused, glanced down. "It is under the seat, dear," she replied gently, gesturing toward the securely placed bag. Annette pursed her lips, clearly at a loss. Instead of admitting her mistake, she doubled down. "Just make sure it stays there," she said sharply before storming off. The passengers around Eleanor began to whisper amongst themselves, their disapproval of Annette's behavior evident. One woman seated across the aisle leaned over and whispered, "Don't let her get to you, ma'am. She's been like this since boarding." Eleanor offered the woman a small smile, grateful for the support. But she couldn't help feeling the weight of Annette's hostility. It wasn't just about the words or actions, it was the deliberate intent behind them. The effort to make her feel unwelcome. As the flight continued, Annette's behavior became more erratic. Her attempts to undermine Eleanor only served to highlight her own unprofessionalism. Several passengers discreetly began recording the interactions, their phones capturing every sharp comment and dismissive gesture. They didn't know Eleanor's story, but they recognized an injustice when they saw one. Eleanor, meanwhile, maintained her composure. Years of facing adversity had taught her the power of grace in the face of hostility. She sat quietly, looking out the window, her thoughts drifting to the joy awaiting her at her destination. But little did she know, the tension on board was building toward a breaking point. Annette, emboldened by her perceived authority, decided to take matters further. She strode down the aisle and stopped abruptly in front of Eleanor's row. "Ma'am," she said loudly, her tone dripping with false politeness, "I need you to come with me." Eleanor turned her head, startled by the abruptness of Annette's request. "Is there a problem?" she asked calmly. Annette crossed her arms, her voice taking on a sharper edge. "You've been causing a disturbance since you boarded this flight. I've given you multiple chances to follow instructions, but you've refused to comply." A murmur spread through the cabin as passengers exchanged puzzled and concerned looks. They had witnessed Eleanor's calm demeanor and Annette's repeated hostility, and it was clear to most of them that the accusation was baseless. Eleanor met Annette's gaze steadily, her voice soft but firm. "I haven't caused any disturbance. I've simply been sitting here minding my own business." Annette didn't respond. Instead, she turned sharply and walked to the front of the plane, where she picked up the intercom and spoke to the pilot. "Captain," she said, her voice loud and authoritative, "we have a passenger in 2A who is being disruptive and non-compliant. I'm requesting immediate removal before takeoff." Gasps rippled through the cabin as the passengers reacted to the announcement. Several voices rose in protest, their frustration bubbling over. "She hasn't done anything wrong," one man exclaimed. "This is ridiculous," muttered another woman, shaking her head. But Annette ignored them, her eyes fixed on Eleanor as she awaited the arrival of airport security. The cabin grew unnervingly silent as Annette Carter's announcement hung in the air. Eleanor Simmons sat composed, her hands resting gently on her lap, but the weight of the accusation stung deeply. Around her, murmurs of disbelief turned into clear protests from the passengers. "This is outrageous," a man in a business suit said, standing halfway out of his seat. "She hasn't caused any trouble." "She's the calmest person here," added a woman clutching a toddler, her voice sharp with indignation. Annette, however, was unmoved. Her heels clicked purposefully as she strode to the front of the plane, ignoring the growing unrest behind her. Moments later, 2 uniformed airport security officers boarded. Their serious expressions only heightened the tension. "Ma'am," one of the officers addressed Eleanor gently, "we've been asked to escort you off the plane." Eleanor looked up at the officers, her calm eyes betraying just a hint of sadness. "Of course," she said softly, reaching for her handbag. Her movements were deliberate, every action reflecting the dignity she carried, even in the face of blatant humiliation. As Eleanor stood, several passengers raised their voices. "This isn't right," shouted the man who had helped Eleanor with her luggage earlier. "She's done nothing wrong," another added. A young girl, sitting beside her mother, tugged on the woman's sleeve. "Why are they taking her?" the child asked, her voice trembling. Sometimes, the mother whispered gently, people are treated unfairly. But we can make sure it doesn't go unnoticed. Eleanor turned to the passengers around her and offered a small smile. "Thank you for your kindness," she said, her voice steady despite the turmoil. "I'm sorry for any inconvenience." The officers led Eleanor down the aisle, her posture as graceful as ever. Annette stood at the front, arms crossed, a small smirk tugging at her lips. To her, this was a victory, a reassertion of authority and control. But Annette was unaware of the phones that had recorded the entire incident. Dozens of passengers had captured her hostility and Eleanor's quiet dignity. Even as Eleanor stepped off the plane, the wheels of accountability had already begun to turn. In the terminal, Eleanor was seated in a quiet corner while the officers completed the necessary paperwork. One of them, sensing her discomfort, spoke up. "Ma'am, we're just following protocol. If you'd like to file a complaint, we can assist you with that." "Thank you," Eleanor replied, her tone polite but firm. She appreciated their professionalism, but she knew this situation required a different course of action. Reaching into her handbag, Eleanor pulled out her cell phone. For a moment, she stared at the screen, her fingers hovering over the contact list. She was not one to cause trouble or demand special treatment, but this was different. Finally, she dialed a number. It rang twice before a deep, familiar voice answered. "Mom," said Marcus Simmons, the CEO of the airline, his voice warm. "You should be on the plane by now. Is everything okay?" Eleanor hesitated, not wanting to upset him, but she knew he needed to hear the truth. "Marcus," she began, her tone calm, "I've been removed from the flight." The pause on the other end of the line was palpable. "Removed?" Marcus repeated, his voice suddenly sharp. "Why? What happened?" "The lead flight attendant claimed I was causing a disturbance," Eleanor explained. "I wasn't. I think she didn't like the way I looked." Marcus took a deep breath, his usual composure giving way to a controlled fury. "Are you serious? On one of my planes?" "Yes," Eleanor said softly. "I didn't argue. I left quietly, but I thought you should know." There was another pause before Marcus spoke again, his voice laced with determination. "Mom, where are you right now?" "I'm at gate 12, she replied. "Stay there." "I'm handling this immediately," Marcus said, his tone final. As Eleanor ended the call, she felt a mix of emotions, relief that her son would address the situation and sadness at the ordeal she had endured. She reminded herself that this wasn't just about her. It was about ensuring no one else would face such treatment. Meanwhile, aboard the plane, Annette prepared for takeoff, oblivious to the storm brewing around her. She adjusted her blazer, basking in the satisfaction of having resolved the situation. To her, the removal of Eleanor was a demonstration of her authority, a way to maintain control over the cabin. What Annette didn't realize was that Marcus Simmons was already mobilizing his team. Within minutes of the call, he was on the phone with Linda Carter, the senior operations manager. "Linda," Marcus began sharply, "I just received an alarming report. My mother, Eleanor Simmons, was forcibly removed from one of our flights. I need an explanation. Now." Linda's professionalism faltered for a moment. "Your mother?" she stammered, quickly typing into her computer to pull up the flight records. "Yes," Marcus confirmed, his voice cold. "She deliberately keeps her connection to me private to avoid preferential treatment. But that doesn't excuse what happened. I want the details. Who was responsible, what was said, and why this wasn't escalated to me immediately." "Yes, sir," Linda replied, already scanning the flight logs. "The lead flight attendant, Annette Carter, reported your mother as disruptive and requested her removal before takeoff. There have also been multiple passenger complaints filed against Miss Carter during boarding." "Complaints?" Marcus asked, his anger simmering. "Yes," Linda continued. "Some passengers even recorded the incident. I'm pulling the footage now." "Send me everything," Marcus ordered, "and inform the ground crew that I'm on my way to the airport. Have security detain Miss Carter when the flight lands. I want to speak with her personally." "Yes, sir," Linda said, her tone resolute. As Marcus ended the call, his focus sharpened. This wasn't just about his mother anymore. It was about addressing a systemic issue within his airline. The airport terminal buzzed with its usual activity, but in one corner, a storm was quietly brewing. Marcus Simmons, the CEO of the airline, arrived at Gate 12 with a determined stride. His normally composed demeanor was replaced with visible intensity, a mix of frustration and protectiveness driving his every step. His mother, Eleanor, sat waiting calmly. She rose to greet him, her expression warm despite the ordeal she had endured. "Marcus," she said softly as he embraced her. "Are you all right, Mom?" Marcus asked, his voice filled with both concern and resolve. "I'm fine," Eleanor assured him. "I've faced worse, but this time, it's not just about me. It's about making sure this doesn't happen to anyone else." Marcus nodded, his jaw tightening. "You're right. This ends now." As Marcus spoke with Eleanor, his team had already begun gathering evidence. Passenger complaints, eyewitness accounts, and video recordings were sent directly to his phone. Each piece painted a damning picture of Annette Carter's unprofessional behavior and the injustice Eleanor had faced. Back on the plane, Annette was preparing for what she believed would be a routine departure. She moved briskly through the cabin, her heels clicking against the floor as she performed final checks. Her air of authority remained intact, bolstered by what she considered a successful resolution to the disturbance. But her confidence was about to be shattered. Moments before takeoff, a voice crackled over the intercom. "Miss Annette Carter, please report to the front of the cabin immediately." Annette frowned, confused but still composed. With a sigh of annoyance, she handed off her duties to another attendant and made her way to the front. There, 2 uniformed security officers stood waiting. "Miss Carter," one of them said, his tone firm, "we need you to step off the plane with us." "What?" Annette's voice rose in disbelief. "Why? I have a flight to manage." "This isn't up for debate," the officer replied curtly. "Please come with us immediately." Passengers turned their heads, whispering among themselves as Annette reluctantly complied. Her earlier authority seemed to evaporate as she walked down the aisle under the scrutiny of dozens of eyes. When Annette stepped into the terminal, she was met by a small group of people, including the airline's legal team and Linda Carter, the senior operations manager. At the center of it all stood Marcus Simmons. His presence radiated authority, and his piercing gaze cut through Annette's initial attempt to put on a composed front. "Mr. Simmons," Annette began, her voice overly polite. "I'm not sure what this is about, but I have a flight to oversee." Marcus raised a hand, silencing her immediately. "Do you have any idea who the passenger you removed from that flight was?" he asked, his voice low but deadly calm. Annette blinked, her confidence wavering. She was being disruptive, she stammered. She wasn't following instructions? "That passenger," Marcus interrupted, his tone icy, "is my mother." Annette's face drained of color. "Your mother?" she echoed, her voice barely audible. "Yes," Marcus said, stepping closer. "Eleanor Simmons. The woman you humiliated, mistreated, and falsely accused of being unruly. I've reviewed the evidence, passenger complaints, videos, and your own actions. Every single one confirms that your behavior was not only unprofessional, but also discriminatory and cruel." Annette opened her mouth to protest, but Marcus didn't give her the chance. "You singled her out because of her appearance," he continued, his words cutting like a blade. "You refused to assist her, publicly demeaned her, and then escalated the situation to have her removed from the plane. That is not a protocol. It's prejudice." "I was just following the rules," Annette tried to argue. She was pressing the call button repeatedly, slowing things down. "I thought—" "You thought wrong," Marcus said, his voice rising slightly. "You thought you could mistreat an elderly woman and get away with it. But let me make this clear. There is no place for that kind of behavior in this airline." Annette's hands trembled as she clutched the hem of her blazer. "Please, Mr. Simmons, I've worked here for years." "This was a misunderstanding. This conversation is over," Marcus declared firmly. Turning to the security officers, he added, "Escort her out of the terminal. Make sure she doesn't step foot on another one of our planes." One of the officers stepped forward, holding a clipboard. "You'll need to sign here, acknowledging your termination," he said. Annette's protests turned frantic. "You can't do this. I've given this airline my best." Marcus met her gaze one final time, his tone unyielding. "Your best was a disgrace to everything this company stands for. You're done here." Tears streaming down her face, Annette reluctantly signed the form and handed over her ID badge and uniform jacket. As the officers escorted her out, her head hung low, the weight of her actions finally sinking in. Back at Gate 12, Marcus returned to Eleanor, his anger tempered by a sense of resolution. "Mom," he said, taking her hands in his, "this will never happen again. Not to you, not to anyone." Eleanor smiled softly. "You've always had such a big heart, Marcus. But remember, we can't control how others treat us. We can only control how we respond." Her words, as always, struck a chord with him. "You responded with more grace than I ever could," he admitted. "But this isn't just about how you handled it. It's about making sure no one else has to." As Marcus spoke, news of the incident was already spreading. Passengers on the flight had uploaded their recordings online, and within hours, the videos were going viral. Headlines began to appear, calling out the injustice Eleanor had faced and praising her dignity in the face of adversity. The airline released an immediate statement, apologizing for the incident and promising swift action to address it. But for Marcus and Eleanor, this was just the beginning. As Eleanor sat quietly in the VIP lounge that Marcus had arranged for her, the day's events played on a loop in her mind. She was no stranger to adversity, yet each act of prejudice carried its own sting. However, this time was different. For the first time in a long while, she felt a renewed sense of purpose. This wasn't just about her. Meanwhile, Marcus was already taking decisive action. The videos uploaded by passengers had begun to circulate widely on social media. Clips showing Eleanor's calm composure and Annette's hostile behavior painted a stark contrast that was impossible to ignore. Comments flooded in, decrying the injustice Eleanor had faced. "How could anyone treat such a sweet lady like that?" one user wrote. "This story breaks my heart, but her grace is inspiring," another commented. By the time Marcus returned to the airline's headquarters, the incident had reached news outlets. Headlines like "CEO's mother faces discrimination on airline flight and dignity under fire, passengers poise shames flight attendant" were appearing across platforms. Marcus convened an emergency meeting with his leadership team. "This isn't just about what happened to my mother," he began, his tone sharp but controlled. "This is about ensuring that no passenger, no person, ever has to experience what she did." Linda Carter, the operations manager, spoke next. "We've compiled the complaints from passengers and reviewed the footage. The evidence is overwhelming. Ms. Carter's behavior was unacceptable, and her dismissal is only the beginning." "Good," Marcus replied, "but we need to go further. I want a full overhaul of our training programs. Effective immediately, every employee, from flight attendants to senior executives, will undergo mandatory inclusivity and cultural sensitivity training. We're setting a new standard." The team nodded in agreement, and Marcus continued. "We'll also establish a passenger advocacy program to ensure concerns are addressed promptly and fairly. And I want us to partner with community organizations to promote diversity and representation within the airline industry." While Marcus spearheaded these changes, Eleanor's story continued to gain traction. A popular travel blogger posted a video titled "The Strongest Woman I've Ever Met," praising Eleanor's quiet dignity and resilience. "This isn't just a story about bad service," the blogger said. "This is about a systemic issue that needs to change. And thanks to Mrs. Simmons, we're seeing that change happen." The video quickly went viral, amassing millions of views within hours. People around the world shared their own stories of being mistreated or judged unfairly during travel. Eleanor became a symbol of strength, her name synonymous with grace under pressure. Back in the lounge, Eleanor received her first hint of the media storm when a young flight attendant approached her with a shy smile. "Mrs. Simmons," she said, "I just want to say I'm so sorry for what you went through. You didn't deserve any of it." Eleanor smiled warmly, her tone gentle. "Thank you, dear. Your kindness means a lot to me." The attendant hesitated for a moment before adding, "You're inspiring a lot of people. The videos, well, they're everywhere now. People are talking about you." Eleanor's brows furrowed slightly in surprise. "Videos?" "Yes," the attendant confirmed. "Passengers recorded everything. It's all over the news. They're calling you a hero." Eleanor shook her head modestly. "I'm no hero. I just want to see my great-grandchildren." But deep down, Eleanor knew this moment was about more than just her journey. Her son had told her earlier, "We can't let this incident go unanswered," and now she understood the full weight of his words. When Marcus returned to the lounge, he found his mother deep in thought, her hands resting on her lap. "Mom," he said, sitting beside her, The world is paying attention. Eleanor looked at him, her expression thoughtful. Marcus, this isn't just about fixing one mistake. This is about changing how we treat each other everywhere. I agree, Marcus replied. And we're starting right here with this airline. But I need your help. Eleanor raised a curious brow. My help? Marcus nodded. Your perspective is invaluable. You've lived through things I can only imagine. If we're going to build something better, we need people like you to lead the way. Eleanor considered his words carefully. She had always believed in leading by example and using grace and determination to inspire others. After a moment, she nodded. If you think I can help, then I'll do it. But on one condition. Name it, Marcus said. I want to ensure this change reaches everyone, not just passengers, but the employees who make these flights possible. Everyone deserves respect, Marcus, from the ground crew to the executives. Marcus smiled. I wouldn't have it any other way. The next morning, the airline released a formal statement. Signed by Marcus himself, it read, We deeply regret the unacceptable treatment of one of our passengers, Mrs. Eleanor Simmons, by a member of our staff. Such behavior does not reflect the values of our airline. Effective immediately, we are implementing mandatory training programs to promote inclusivity, respect, and professionalism across all levels of our organization. To Mrs. Simmons and the passengers who witnessed this incident, we offer our sincerest apologies and a commitment to do better. The statement was accompanied by an announcement that the airline would also refund all passengers on the flight and provide them with complimentary future travel. The response was swift and overwhelmingly positive. This is how a company takes accountability, one social media user wrote. Kudos to Marcus Simmons for leading with integrity. Eleanor's story sparked a conversation that extended far beyond the airline industry. Advocacy groups praised her as a symbol of resilience, and her name became a rallying cry for change. As Eleanor sat in the comfort of the VIP lounge, sipping tea and gazing out the window at the planes parked on the tarmac, her thoughts drifted to the past. The day's events had stirred memories she had long kept tucked away, moments of struggle and quiet resilience that had shaped the woman she had become. Eleanor Simmons was born and raised in the Deep South, during an era when segregation was not just common, but enforced by law. The world she grew up in was a rigid one, divided by race and riddled with prejudice. She vividly remembered the whites-only signs that barred her family from entering certain restaurants, stores, or even parks. One memory in particular stood out, as sharp and vivid as if it had happened yesterday. Eleanor was just 9 years old, clutching a handful of carefully saved pennies in her small hand. She and her father had gone to the local general store so she could buy a notebook for her school lessons. She had been so proud of her little savings, earned by helping her mother with chores and selling homemade biscuits to neighbors. When it was their turn in line, the shopkeeper, a gruff man with a perpetually sour expression, snatched the notebook from Eleanor's hand. "We don't sell to your kind," he said coldly, tossing the notebook onto a shelf behind him. Eleanor's father, a quiet and dignified man, took her hand without a word and led her out of the store. She remembered the tears welling up in his eyes as they walked home. He didn't explain or make excuses for the man's behavior. He didn't have to. Even as a child, Eleanor understood the injustice they had faced. That moment left a deep mark on Eleanor's young heart. It was the first time she truly grasped the cruelty of prejudice and the weight it could place on a person's soul. But rather than let it break her, she vowed to rise above it. As Eleanor grew older, the challenges only intensified. She married young, and her husband Henry was a kind and hardworking man who shared her dreams of a better life. Together they faced the harsh realities of a segregated society. Henry worked long hours as a factory laborer, while Eleanor took on jobs as a housekeeper for wealthy families. She endured being treated as invisible, or worse, as someone undeserving of basic respect. One employer, a woman who hosted lavish social gatherings, once said within Eleanor's earshot, "People like her don't need education or ambition. They're meant to serve, and that's all." Eleanor hadn't responded, but in her heart she made a silent promise. "My children will never hear words like these. They will have opportunities I never did. I will make sure of it." That promise became Eleanor's life's mission. She worked tirelessly, sometimes taking on double shifts or going without meals so she could save money for her children's education. She encouraged them to dream big and reminded them daily that their worth wasn't defined by how others saw them, but by their own actions and character. Her son, Marcus, had been a bright and ambitious child from the start. Eleanor still remembered the day he came home clutching a worn notebook filled with airplane sketches. "Mama," he had said with excitement shining in his eyes, "I'm going to build planes one day." Eleanor had smiled and replied, "Then you better work hard, baby. Dreaming is free, but success comes at a price." Marcus took her words to heart. He excelled in school, earning scholarships that took him to places Eleanor had only ever heard of in stories. He studied aeronautical engineering and later business, eventually rising through the ranks of the aviation industry to become the CEO of one of the nation's largest airlines. Eleanor had always been proud of Marcus, not just for his accomplishments but for the man he had become. He never forgot his roots, and at every milestone in his career, he credited his success to his mother's sacrifices. "This is because of her," he would say. "My mother is the reason I'm here today." But Eleanor's journey wasn't without heartbreak. Henry passed away when Marcus was just a teenager, leaving her to raise their children alone. Those years were the hardest of her life. She worked relentlessly, sometimes cleaning 3 houses in a single day to make ends meet. Yet, despite the exhaustion, she never let her children see her despair. Instead, she filled their home with love, laughter, and hope. Every night she read to them, instilling values of kindness, perseverance, and faith. She taught them that dignity wasn't about how others treated them. It was about how they carried themselves, no matter the circumstances. Sitting in the lounge now, Eleanor thought about how far she and her family had come. Yet despite all their progress, the incident on the flight reminded her that prejudice was a shadow that could reappear at any moment. For a brief instant, she felt like that 9-year-old girl in the general store again, unseen, unwanted, and unworthy. But as she straightened her posture and took another sip of tea, Eleanor reminded herself of something she had told Marcus long ago. Dignity isn't about how others treat you, it's about how you carry yourself. That belief had carried her through the darkest times, and it would carry her now. She wasn't just a passenger who had been mistreated. She was a mother, a grandmother, a great-grandmother, and a survivor of countless battles, each of which had only made her stronger. As she waited for Marcus to return, Eleanor felt a renewed sense of purpose. This wasn't just another act of prejudice. This was an opportunity to spark change, to remind the world that respect and dignity should be universal. The next morning, Eleanor woke up to an entirely different atmosphere. What had begun as a quiet trip to visit her great-grandchildren had transformed into a growing movement for change. Marcus had wasted no time in setting plans into motion, determined to ensure that the airline addressed not only his mother's experience, but the deeper issues it revealed. Eleanor arrived at the airline's headquarters with Marcus later that day. Despite her insistence that she didn't need to be involved, Marcus had encouraged her to take an active role. "You're not just my mother," he told her. "You're the reason I understand what dignity means. You can help us lead this change." Walking into the sleek, modern building, Eleanor couldn't help but feel a mix of apprehension and resolve. Employees whispered as she passed, some recognizing her from the viral videos that had dominated the news. In a private boardroom, Marcus convened the airline's senior leadership team. Eleanor sat quietly at first, observing the proceedings. Marcus's voice carried authority as he laid out the initiatives he wanted to be implemented immediately. "Our first step," Marcus began, "is revising our employee training programs. From this day forward, every single member of our staff, from ground crew to senior executives, will undergo comprehensive inclusivity and cultural sensitivity training." Linda Carter, the operations manager, nodded. "We've already started developing the curriculum," she said. "It'll cover unconscious bias, respectful communication, and strategies for fostering a more inclusive workplace." "Good," Marcus replied. "But that's not enough. We need accountability. I want an independent review board established to handle passenger complaints and employee conduct issues. We need transparency in how we address these matters." Eleanor watched with quiet pride as her son led the discussion. His determination to create meaningful change reminded her of the boy who once sketched planes and dreamed of building a better future. As the meeting continued, Marcus turned to his mother. "Mom, would you like to share your thoughts?" Eleanor hesitated for a moment, then stood, her voice steady but gentle. "Thank you, Marcus. I'll say this, the changes you're proposing are a good start, but they'll only matter if they reach the heart of the company. Respect isn't just a policy, it's a culture. And culture starts with people." The room fell silent as Eleanor continued. "I've lived long enough to see how prejudice can damage not just individuals but entire communities. It's not always loud or obvious. Sometimes it's subtle, a glance, a tone, an assumption. But those small actions can leave lasting scars." She paused, her gaze sweeping the room. "If we want to make real change, we need to make sure everyone feels valued, no matter their role. That means listening to the voices of those who are often overlooked, the employees on the ground, the passengers who don't fit a certain mold. Everyone deserves to be treated with dignity." The executives exchanged thoughtful glances, clearly moved by her words. Marcus nodded. "She's right. Let's not just focus on fixing this one incident. Let's build a system that ensures respect and fairness for everyone." Eleanor's role didn't end with the meeting. Over the following weeks, she worked closely with Marcus and his team, offering insights and helping shape new policies. She advocated for programs that went beyond surface-level fixes, pushing for scholarships and mentorship opportunities for underrepresented groups interested in pursuing careers in aviation. "We can't just talk about diversity," Eleanor said during one discussion. "We need to create pathways for it." Her influence extended beyond policy. Eleanor became a visible presence at the airline, meeting with employees at all levels. She spoke with flight attendants, mechanics, and customer service representatives, listening to their stories and sharing her own. One young attendant confided in her, "I've seen things like this happen before, but I didn't know how to speak up. Seeing how you handled it, it's given me courage." Eleanor smiled warmly. "Courage doesn't mean you're not afraid. It means you do the right thing anyway. And now you have a voice. Use it." Eleanor's involvement soon had an impact on the company. Employees reported a noticeable shift in workplace culture. Supervisors encouraged open dialogue, and the new training programs were met with overwhelmingly positive feedback. At the same time, the public response to the airline's swift actions was equally significant. Advocacy groups praised the changes, calling the airline a model for accountability and inclusivity in the industry. Customers who had been outraged by the initial incident expressed renewed confidence in the company. "I'll fly with them again," one passenger commented on social media. "It's not just about avoiding mistakes, it's about how you handle them. And they've handled this with integrity." Eleanor's story also inspired broader conversations about respect and equality in the travel industry. Other airlines began implementing similar training programs, and several even reached out to Marcus for guidance on creating more inclusive policies. Through it all, Eleanor remained humble. "I didn't do anything extraordinary," she told a journalist during an interview. "I just tried to handle a difficult situation with grace. But if my story can help others, then I'm grateful for that." As Eleanor continued her work with the airline, she couldn't help but reflect on how far things had come. The incident on the flight had reopened old wounds, but it had also sparked a ripple effect of change that reached far beyond her own experience. For Marcus, having his mother involved was a source of both pride and motivation. Her wisdom and perspective reminded him of the values she had instilled in him from a young age: respect, perseverance, and the importance of doing what's right. "We still have a long way to go," Marcus told his team during a follow-up meeting. "But thanks to my mother, we're on the right path." Eleanor smiled, her heart swelling with both pride and hope. For the first time in a long while, she felt that the world was changing for the better, and that she had played a part in making it happen. While Eleanor and Marcus focused on rebuilding the airline's culture, Annette Carter found herself at the center of an entirely different storm. What she had thought would be an ordinary flight had unraveled into a scandal that threatened to upend her entire life. The videos of Annette's behavior spread rapidly across social media. Passengers' recordings showed her dismissive tone, sharp remarks, and the unfair treatment Eleanor had endured. Clips were shared with captions like, "Discrimination in the skies and grace under fire," how one passenger handled cruelty with dignity. The public's reaction was swift and unforgiving. Annette's name trended online and was linked to hashtags like "Justice for Eleanor" and "No Room for Hate." Outraged commenters flooded her social media accounts, calling out her behavior as unprofessional and prejudiced. "How could someone in customer service act this way?" One user wrote. "Bookmark, go back. This woman doesn't deserve to wear that uniform," another commented. The backlash didn't stop with social media. News outlets picked up the story, dissecting Annette's actions and highlighting Eleanor's poise throughout the ordeal. Journalists reached out to passengers for interviews, many of whom corroborated Eleanor's account. "I couldn't believe how she treated that lady," one passenger said in a televised interview. "It was obvious she was targeting her for no reason." The scrutiny intensified when reporters uncovered past social media posts from Annette that revealed troubling attitudes about race and class. Though unrelated to her actions on the flight, these posts painted a picture of someone whose views clashed with the values of inclusivity and respect. Annette's polished public image began to crumble. Within days, she was summoned for a formal meeting with the airline's HR department, where she was terminated for gross misconduct. The company issued a statement emphasizing its zero-tolerance policy for discrimination and pledging to take steps to prevent similar incidents in the future. Despite the clarity of her dismissal, Annette struggled to accept the consequences. She attempted to defend herself, claiming her actions had been misunderstood. "I was under stress," she said in one interview. "I didn't mean to come across as harsh. It's all been blown out of proportion." But her excuses fell flat in the face of overwhelming evidence. Videos of the incident, coupled with first-hand accounts, left little room for doubt about her behavior. As news of Annette's termination spread, her professional prospects evaporated. Potential employers in the travel and hospitality industries were reluctant to hire someone with such a high-profile scandal attached to their name. Annette found herself blacklisted, her once promising career reduced to ashes. The personal consequences were equally severe. Friends and acquaintances began distancing themselves, uncomfortable with the public nature of her downfall. For the first time, Annette was forced to confront the impact of her actions, not just on her career, but on how others viewed her. Meanwhile, Eleanor's story continued to resonate far and wide. Advocacy groups praised her as a symbol of quiet strength and resilience, using her experience to call for greater accountability across industries. Eleanor, however, remained humble. When asked about Annette during an interview, she responded with grace. "I don't hold anger in my heart," she said. "Anger only weighs you down. But I hope she learns from this. We all have the capacity to grow and change if we're willing to reflect on our mistakes." Her words struck a chord with audiences, further solidifying her reputation as a figure of dignity and compassion. As Annette retreated from public view, Eleanor became increasingly visible in her new role within the airline. She worked closely with Marcus and the leadership team to implement changes that prioritized respect and inclusion. Her influence extended beyond policy. She became a trusted advisor to employees at every level, and her presence was a constant reminder of the company's commitment to doing better. In one meeting with the flight attendant team, Eleanor spoke about her experience in a way that inspired reflection and accountability. "When I boarded that flight, I didn't expect special treatment," she said. "I only expected kindness, the same kindness we all deserve as human beings." Her words resonated deeply, prompting many employees to reconsider their own attitudes and behaviors. Some even approached Eleanor privately to express their gratitude. Mrs. Simmons, one young attendant, said, "I've made mistakes in how I've treated passengers before. Hearing your story has made me want to do better." Eleanor smiled gently. "Acknowledging our mistakes is the first step toward change. The second is making sure we don't repeat them." The ripple effects of Eleanor's story reached far beyond the airline. Other companies in the travel industry began adopting similar inclusivity training programs, and advocacy groups used her experience to push for broader reforms. For Marcus, The changes within his airline represented more than just good business. They were personal. "This isn't just about protecting passengers," he told his leadership team. "It's about honoring the values my mother taught me. Values of respect, fairness, and integrity." As the airline continued to rebuild its reputation, Eleanor's influence became a source of pride for employees and passengers alike. Customers frequently approached her during flights, thanking her for her bravery and grace. One elderly woman, on her way to visit her grandchildren, said tearfully, "You've given people like me hope. Thank you for standing up for us." Eleanor's humility never wavered. "I only did what I believed was right," she replied. "But if my story has inspired others, then I'm grateful for that." Meanwhile, Annette's life had taken a starkly different turn. Stripped of her professional identity and shunned by her community, she struggled to find a path forward. Yet as she watched the changes unfolding in the airline and beyond, she began to reflect on the choices that had led her there. Perhaps, she thought, this was her chance to start anew, to rebuild herself, not as the person she had been, but as someone who could embody the values she had once failed to uphold. Months had passed since the incident aboard Flight 302, but its ripple effects were still being felt far and wide. Eleanor Simmons had not only become a prominent figure within the airline, but also a symbol of transformation for an entire industry. Her presence at the airline's headquarters had reshaped its culture from the ground up. Employees at every level found inspiration in Eleanor's story and her unwavering commitment to fairness and dignity. The policies Marcus and his team implemented, many of which were shaped by Eleanor's input, had turned the airline into a leader in inclusivity and customer care. One of the most impactful changes was the new passenger advocacy program, which ensured that every passenger's concerns were addressed promptly and fairly. The airline also introduced scholarships for underrepresented groups pursuing careers in aviation, an initiative Eleanor had personally championed. "We don't just want to talk about diversity," Eleanor told a gathering of employees. "We want to create opportunities for it to flourish." Her influence extended beyond the airline. News of the company's reforms had inspired other airlines to follow suit. Competitors began implementing their own inclusivity training programs, and some reached out to Eleanor for advice. "What would you say is the most important thing to get right?" one CEO asked during a joint industry panel. Eleanor smiled gently before responding. "It starts with listening. Too often people in positions of power forget to truly hear the voices of those they serve. Respect begins with understanding." Her words resonated deeply, sparking meaningful conversations among industry leaders. Advocacy groups also took note, hailing Eleanor's efforts as a model for systemic change. But Eleanor's impact wasn't limited to the corporate world. Her story touched the hearts of everyday people who saw her as a beacon of hope and resilience. Letters poured in from around the world, messages of gratitude, admiration, and personal stories of overcoming adversity. One letter came from a single mother in Chicago who wrote, "Your strength reminded me that I, too, can carry on with dignity, even when life feels unfair." Another came from a young pilot in training who said, "Because of you, I believe there's a place for someone like me in this industry." Eleanor made it a point to read every letter, replying to as many as she could. "If my experience can inspire others to hold their heads high and demand respect," she said, "then I've done something worthwhile." Her role within the airline also evolved. Marcus, recognizing the unique perspective his mother brought, appointed her as an official advisor to the board. While Eleanor initially hesitated to accept the position, she ultimately agreed, seeing it as an opportunity to influence lasting change. "I'm not here for titles," Eleanor told Marcus. "But if I can help make this airline a place where everyone is treated with dignity, then I'll do my part." The board meetings were unlike anything Eleanor had experienced before. As the only woman of her age and background in the room, she brought a perspective that often challenged traditional thinking. During one meeting, Eleanor spoke up about balancing profitability with passenger satisfaction. "Profit is important," she said, her voice steady. "But respect is priceless. If you treat people with care, they'll remember that, and they'll come back." Her insights proved invaluable. Customer satisfaction scores rose steadily in the months following the reforms, and the airline's reputation, once tarnished, began to soar. "It's not just about fixing what's broken," Marcus said during a company-wide address. "It's about building something better. And we couldn't have done it without my mother's guidance." Eleanor's story continued to inspire beyond the airline's walls. Advocacy groups used her experience as a rallying cry for broader reforms in industries where discrimination and bias persisted. Community organizations invited her to speak at events where she shared her journey with grace and humility. At one such event, a young woman approached Eleanor after her speech, tears in her eyes. "Mrs. Simmons," she said, "I grew up thinking that people like me didn't belong in spaces like these. Seeing you here changes that." Eleanor took the woman's hands in her own and said, "We all belong. Don't let anyone make you think otherwise." The media, too, continued to follow Eleanor's story. Documentaries were made chronicling her life and the changes she had inspired, highlighting her rise from humble beginnings to becoming a catalyst for change in the aviation industry. One journalist asked Eleanor during an interview, "Did you ever imagine that one flight could lead to all this?" Eleanor chuckled softly. "Life has a way of surprising us," she said, "but I've always believed that even small actions can create big ripples. We just have to have the courage to take the first step." Marcus, meanwhile, reflected on the profound impact his mother had on him and the company. "She's taught me that leadership isn't just about making decisions," he said during a leadership summit. "It's about making a difference, and that's exactly what she's done." The airline's transformation became a case study of how businesses could turn adversity into opportunity. Universities invited Marcus and Eleanor to speak to students about their journey, emphasizing the importance of integrity and empathy in leadership. Through it all, Eleanor remained humble, often deflecting praise onto her son or the employees who had embraced the new initiatives. "This isn't about me," she would say. "It's about all of us working together to create something better." As the months turned into years, the changes Eleanor and Marcus had implemented became deeply ingrained in the airline's identity. Employees, passengers, and industry peers alike credited their efforts with setting a new standard for respect and inclusivity. For Eleanor, the greatest reward wasn't the accolades or recognition. It was knowing that her story had made a difference, not just for her, but for countless others who would now experience the kindness and dignity they deserved. Years after the incident that sparked a transformative movement, Eleanor Simmons found herself sitting in a quiet corner of the airline's headquarters, reflecting on how much had changed. What began as a single moment of injustice had grown into a legacy of progress, fueled by the determination of those who believed in fairness, respect, and the power of doing what's right. The airline had undergone a complete cultural shift. Employees, from executives to ground crew, now embraced a shared commitment to dignity and inclusivity. Passengers, too, had noticed the change, often sharing their positive experiences in online reviews and personal letters. One passenger who had flown with the airline after years of avoiding air travel wrote, "It's amazing to see an airline treat every passenger like they matter. You don't just feel like a ticket number here. You feel like a person." Eleanor's influence was woven into every aspect of the company's operations. The training programs she helped design became a gold standard in the industry, replicated by other airlines and adopted by businesses outside aviation. Scholars began referring to the Simmons model in leadership courses, praising its focus on empathy-driven decision-making. Though humbled by the recognition, Eleanor always downplayed her role. "It was a team effort," she often said. "I just reminded people of something they already knew, that treating others with respect isn't hard, it's human." Eleanor's family also continued to thrive. Her son Marcus remained the airline's CEO, and his leadership was sharpened by the lessons his mother had taught him. Under his guidance, the company became not just a leader in customer service, but also a major force for social change. But for Eleanor, the most rewarding part of her journey was seeing her family grow. Her trip to visit her great-grandchildren, delayed but not forgotten, had become a cherished memory. She often smiled when she thought of their small arms wrapped around her, their laughter filling the air as she recounted stories of her life. One sunny afternoon, Marcus surprised Eleanor with an invitation to a special ceremony at the airline's main terminal. "You'll want to see this, Mom," he said with a knowing smile. Eleanor arrived to find a crowd gathered near one of the gates. A large banner hung overhead, bearing the words, "The Eleanor Simmons Gate of Hope." As applause erupted, Marcus stepped forward to address the crowd. "This gate isn't just a place for passengers to board flights," he began. "It's a symbol of everything my mother has taught us about resilience, grace, and the importance of standing up for what's right. It's a reminder that one person's courage can inspire change for countless others." Tears filled Eleanor's eyes as Marcus continued. "Mom, this is for you, not just for what you endured, but for how you turned that moment into a movement. Thank you for showing us the way." The crowd cheered as Eleanor stepped forward, her voice trembling but steady. "Thank you," she said, her hands gripping the podium. "This is more than I could have ever imagined. But I hope it serves as a reminder, not just of my story, but of the power we all have to make a difference. Every act of kindness, every stand for what's right, creates a ripple that can change the world." Bookmark. The dedication ceremony was covered widely in the media, with headlines celebrating Eleanor's legacy. From injustice to inspiration, one article read, "How Eleanor Simmons Changed the Skies and Beyond." In the years that followed, Eleanor continued to be a presence at the airline, offering guidance and support whenever needed. Though she officially retired from her advisory role, employees still sought her wisdom, often calling her the heart of the company. On her last day in the office, a young flight attendant approached Eleanor with a bouquet of flowers. "Mrs. Simmons," she said, "you've made this airline a family. Thank you for teaching us what it means to care." Eleanor smiled, her heart full. "It's not just about caring for passengers," she replied. "It's about caring for each other. That's how we make the skies and the world a better place." As Eleanor stepped outside into the warm sunlight, she felt a deep sense of peace. Her journey, though marked by challenges, had led to something far greater than she could have imagined. Later that evening, Eleanor sat on her porch, watching the sun dip below the horizon. Her great-grandchildren played in the yard, their laughter carrying on the breeze. Marcus joined her, a quiet moment of reflection passing between them. "You know, Mom," he said, "I've always wanted to make you proud. But the truth is, everything I've done is because of what you taught me." Eleanor reached for his hand, her smile soft. "And you've taught me that even when the skies seem dark, there's always light waiting to break through." As they sat together, Eleanor couldn't help but feel grateful, not just for the changes she had inspired, but for the love and hope that had carried her through. Her story was no longer just her own. It belonged to everyone who believed in the power of kindness, resilience, and the unwavering belief that we can always do better. Eleanor Simmons' journey is more than just a story of resilience and dignity. It's a powerful reminder of how one person's strength can spark meaningful change. Her calm response to adversity and her refusal to let prejudice define her actions showcase the importance of grace under pressure. From the indignity she endured to the systemic transformation she inspired, Eleanor's experience teaches us that even the smallest acts of courage can create ripples far beyond what we can imagine. This story highlights the value of standing up against injustice, not with anger or retaliation, but with poise and determination. It challenges us to reflect on how we treat others in our everyday lives, reminding us that respect and kindness should never be conditional. Eleanor's example also demonstrates the power of leadership, rooted in empathy. Through her influence and her son's decisive actions, they turned a moment of pain into a movement of progress, proving that change is possible when we address issues head-on and work together for a better future. If this story moves you, we want to hear your thoughts. Was it inspiring? Did Eleanor's strength and grace leave an impact on you? If you thought the story was good, comment with a 1. If you thought it was amazing, comment with a 2. We'd love to hear your own stories of resilience and kindness. Share them with us in the comments below. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel so you won't miss more meaningful stories like this one. Let us know your thoughts, and together, let's continue to spread the message of respect and understanding.